I know what I'm like.
Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. As most of you are well aware of, I have a keen interest in criminal justice and juvenile justice and in the history of both. So I've got a professor here to talk to us about the history of juvenile justice. She's a professor of history at the University of Guelph. Her research interests include the history of gender, childhood, and the history of juvenile delinquency. She's also the author of Magdalenes, Prostitution in the 19th Century. Professor Linda Mahood, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
So, when were juveniles first treated as a separate class of offender, and why did this change occur?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and there's a historical answer to it. There's also sort of a philosophical answer to it as well. But generally speaking, it's a part of a social movement that came out of the late 1700s. The late 1700s is a period that sort of often thought of as the very end of what we call the early modern period in history, in European and North American history. It's if you were in a history class, you would be reading about the Enlightenment. You'd be reading about the scientific revolution. You'd be reading about the rise of humanism. So again, there was a change in the way in which people thought about citizens and people and human rights, I guess would be a word. But at that time, there was a movement called the prison reform movement, and progressive thinking people began to argue that prisons that imprisonment wasn't necessary. It needed to be, you couldn't just be locking people away, that you wanted to reform human potential. And so that prisons needed to be reformed. Within a prison, you needed to have the opportunity for, productive labor and work. And you wanted to take sort of the rough proletariat criminal of the working class and reform them so that they could become they break their spirit, so that when they were reintroduced to society, they could be valuable members of the team, right? So there would be rehabilitation. Before that, people were essentially just executed for even the simplest crimes. Okay, it's really not till 1880 where people where people who commit thieves were just executed, right? Small theft, people were just hanged, right? The idea of taking someone in and rehabilitating them on the state's dollar was inconceivable, right? 25 years, you would have been executed, right? Hanged at the stake, and everybody in the village would have come out and watched, right? So it had a deterrent function. So that's the prison reform movement. I know this is a long answer to a very short question, but from the prison reform movement came another movement called what we call the child saving movement. And it began to be argued that within the prison population, you wanted to segregate offenders. So first offenders, habitual offenders, women, men, children should all have their own institutions, right? Before that, in the early modern period, everybody was just in there together, waiting for their sentences to be carried out in a public pillory. So from this movement began a group of child savers. In Britain, they had Mary Carpenter. In a little bit later in the US, they had Jane Addams. But they came through and they began to argue that children should not be put in the same institutions as adults, and girls shouldn't be in the same with boys, etc. So from that movement, it began to be argued that children had special needs, that the needs of the child, for a child to bond with society, it should have special needs. And so from that movement, then people began to argue that children should be removed from adult prisons and put in their own special institutions, which were either called houses of refuge or juvenile reformatories. So that's a very long answer, but it reflects a new way of thinking about the brain, the body, and rehabilitation.
Okay, So when they first started implementing the changes that you're talking about, what was the age or the average of ages? I suppose it was done at a state level and probably wasn't the same in every state, but what was considered a juvenile? Like today, some states it's 16, I think, some states it's 18, and there's a lot of changes that continue to go on. But back then, what did they consider to be a
Well,
juvenile?
yeah, sort of, since sort of essentially the beginning of history and sort of Judeo-Christian traditions, the age of 7 was usually regarded as the age of reason. The Jesuits would say, give me a child by the age of 7 and I'll show you the man. So the idea was that character would be sort of formed by the age of 7. So essentially for juvenile reformatories, coming in around the age of 7, although there's lots of cases of children of 5, 4, 5, or 6, maybe that might have been brought into the system. And it would move around, but generally it was about the age of 16. But depending on what kind of offense a child had been found guilty of, it could be 12 or 14 as well, depending on the system. And again, where the parents were at, and if a child, if the parents were kind of working with the administration, they might get a child back earlier, or they might not want the child back, right? But we do have to keep in mind for that people until 1960s anyway were pretty much considered adults by the age of 16.
Right.
I
So
mean,
what type of penalties did they face? So what was the difference? If you're charged as an adult, maybe you get, 10, 15 years for a crime. What was the comparable sentence for a juvenile in
oh
comparison with adults?
yeah, it wasn't really set up that way at all. I mean, it didn't really matter if you were found guilty of something in the family court, or they might call it the juvenile court or the family court. It was usually a court that was held at a separate time of day, so it felt a little bit less like the main part of the prison and more like a special, softer side, maybe with a kinder judge. The judge might have a lot more discretionary powers than they would in the adult system. But it didn't really matter what you'd done. You were until you were 16, regardless of it. So you weren't sentenced to do a time. The sentence was determined by your age, not by what you had done.
Oh, so once you were considered to be an adult, they just let you go, or did they send you to the adult prison?
Depending on what you'd done, you could be then transferred to the adult system for sure. But generally speaking, initially reformatories were supposed to be an alternative to prison. They were supposedly they were supposed to focus on moral reformation, right? The adult system was more about doing the time to fit the crime. The juvenile system was more about almost like a prolonging of childhood.
Mhm.
They would try to sort of almost infantilize young, particularly for boys. There was the idea, certainly in the late 1800s, during the sort of Charles Dickens era, the Artful Dodger, right, that these young bunglers in crime or whatever, they really wanted to be treated as men, so they'd put them into the juvenile reformatory and not treat them like men. They'd whip them like schoolboys, right? They made them go to school, so they were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they were given sort of a mix of moral rehabilitation, which basically meant a lot of scripture reading, right? A lot of corporal punishment, a little bit of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a lot of industrial training. So
Yeah.
that was the cocktail they got in there.
Yeah, I suppose nothing says rehabilitation like beating a kid and then telling him to love his neighbor like he loves himself, right?
That's right. And actually, that's one of the reasons why the lobbies against corporal punishment have always related to what you just said. Is one school of thought, people who are for it think, a good sound whipping in, you'll thank you for it later, right? Those who are against it will say, how is a young person ever going to bond with society when this is how society's been treating children? But again, you've got to keep in mind that corporal punishment in schools, I mean, it really didn't even become any kind of a debate until the 1970s. And that's not
There's-
that long ago. And
yeah,
again, there's
yeah.
always a wave that want to bring it back. There will always be a wave that want to bring it back.
So how has the law pertaining to juveniles changed over the years? I know with the 20th century, there were a lot of reforms that really separated the juvenile system from the adult system. But what were some of the changes or reforms or progress that has been made?
I don't know if I would like to speak in terms of progress, but I do, because again, there's always going to be an exception, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be an exception. It seemed to me that the 19th century, the emphasis in the 19th century, in the 1800s, was all about incarceration, big institutions, right? It was believed that the kind of pseudo family of the institution would be a better family than the flesh and blood family of the young children, right, of the youngsters. It was always seen essentially that by the 19th century, it was sort of seen that you know, it probably wasn't the child's fault. You know, that the adults, it was either poverty, adult behavior, lack of opportunities, sort of blaming the victim, that the child really probably hadn't done anything wrong, but it was the parents' problem. So the idea with institutionalization is to get the child out of the family home as quickly as possible and try and sever all ties with the parents, right? Because again, you got to keep in mind that it's usually the middle class social worker kind of against and doctors and lawyers and cops against sort of the working class family. So the idea was that the parents had chosen their poverty due to some lack of character they had, right? And so the child was the victim. So you get the child out of the home, put them in a big institution, break down all family ties, restrict access, censor the mail, make visiting hours really unpleasant. And eventually the family, they believed, would just drift away. Then the child's reformed through this, this mix of, moral education, religious training, and industrial training. And then they go off and they seek their fortune. And the annual reports of many juvenile reformatories would have a page at the end where former inmates write back to the institution and talk about, and they thank the institution for, intervening at just that right time. And so the boy who goes off to sea and sends his wages home to his widowed mother, that was like the success story. So that's the great age of incarceration. And reformatories became gigantic. 4, 5, 700 kids could be in the same institution. And then around the age of 15, 16, depending on how they're doing, they start to come up with kind of a probationary period, right? The idea was you'd find a job. If it's Europe, then you send them to Australia, Van Diemen's Land, North America, Canada. You emigrate them, right? And then they become a nice white settler force for somewhere in the colonies and the dominions, right? That was the idea. And they stuck with that until around the early 1900s. And then the idea of probation started to come in. And with probation, then you have a probation officer. So the first or second time a child gets caught doing something, breaking some law, or some kind of misdemeanor status offense like truancy from school, or gambling in the streets, or writing a little graffiti or whatever, a truancy officer would visit the house. So with truancy, then you're moving away from the big institution into the home, then becomes like a little prison. And the family has to deal with the probation officer showing up, right? And again, they used to say that probation, when one child was on probation, it wouldn't be long before the other 3 or 4 were as well, right? Because the whole home then, is kind of invaded, right, by the social workers. So probation starts to work with the families a little bit more. And so by the time you move into the 60s and 70s and more recently, there's more effort now to work with parents, to encourage parents to be a part of the efforts that are being done on behalf of their kids. But again, it takes a very willing parent. And I think for the most part, most youth welfare organizations find it it's harder to work with parents.
Now, you mentioned that there was this idea that the parents weren't doing their job and that the kids needed to be morally reformed so that they could, enter society and be better people. So that's still basically the goal. It's not put in such religious terms, but the goal is ultimately to rehabilitate the kids and to have them go on to lead productive lives. How successful has the juvenile system been in accomplishing that over the years? I mean, starting with, maybe the early 1900s up until today. I mean, you
Yeah,
mentioned that you had some kids are writing back and thanking the schools and whatnot, but of course that's like eh, the writings on the back of a book. You only get the good ones. The authors
mhm.
of books aren't putting the critiques on the back, and I'm guessing that the schools aren't doing so either.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. My historical research was done, I focused on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I did interviews with my book on juvenile reformatories. I did interviews with men and women who had been in juvenile reformatories. And my feeling from the experiences they had was it was all really quite individual. For some kids who were, living in poverty, whose parents did have a lot of problems with alcohol or, and other things, going to a reform school for a few years wasn't necessarily a problem. It was better than some of the other alternatives. I mean, sometimes they would keep, brothers and sisters together, brothers and with brothers and sisters with sisters. And sometimes it would work out in that sense, but it was really very individual. Um, Others hated it. They were beaten black and blue. And the schools would say, well, our beatings aren't any worse than the ones that your parents give you. And so it was just a kind of a nasty childhood. But in other cases, it was sort of better than the alternatives. But generally speaking, when the economy is good and the child is reasonably healthy, they grow out of this stuff. Whatever issue was happening in their young lives, um, it's unlikely that it would have warranted, being taken into care and removed from your community and your peers and your kins. Most people grow out of these things naturally anyway.
Right. It seems
So
now
excessive.
to the modern listener, the modern person interested in the topic, it seems obvious that it's better to treat juveniles and adults as adults. But how was it perceived back then in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Was it viewed by and large as a success to treat juveniles differently, or was there that severe pushback that you talked about where people said, no, this just isn't working? What was the public attitude, I guess, is the
Yeah, it's
question.
actually interesting because it's just as complicated then as it was now. The movement to take children out of adult prisons and to put them into their own sort of soft end institutions, juvenile reformatories. Some argue that it was ridiculous. I mean, there's no reason that you do the crime, you do the time. It doesn't matter. And others argued, no, no, we've got to be softer ended. Um, so there was always going to be a debate. They were always debating how much education children should get in those schools. Working class people very frequently objected to juvenile reformatories because they were saying, when we're the respectable working class. Why should the paupers get their children educated for free? So it had to be very clear that the kids that were in reform schools would not be getting as good as or better education than a child just in a public school or a state school. So they had to deliberately hold them back. And so, the teachers that taught in reform schools, they were generally teachers that they weren't unionized schools. They weren't part of any labor legislation. The teachers didn't get paid as well as teachers in the regular system. So they didn't have the same amount of success. They would argue that these children can't be taught because they're the children of the poor. They were sort of racialized or immigrant children. They treated them as sort of being dull and not very smart. So the expectations were very low. the idea was that you were training a labor force of proletariats who would never rise much above sort of the lowest rank of the profession. So you're not training a carpenter, you're training a carpenter's assistant. You're not training a bootmaker, you're making the leather cutter, you know? And again, and girls were just trained for marriage and motherhood. Just trained for marriage and motherhood.
Now,
They didn't get, and it all around sort of religious education. The religious education was designed to teach basic literacy, reading, writing, arithmetic, so you could, read your prayer book. But it was also all the kind of prayers they were taught had a tendency to sort of harangue on sort of the misery of the sinner, right? So the child learned to punish themselves in sort of the soundless, silent anguish of their own minds. Like you just read, like, you suck, to use a modern example. So you're not to break the spirit and then to create somebody who appreciates the value of another man's work. You don't expect a lot of rewards, right? And for women, it was, marriage and motherhood. So you'd be kind of a docile and submissive mother, just devoted to your own, don't leave your own front yard, just look after your own children, look after your husband. And they did really harangue on the dangers of alcohol.
I've noticed that a couple times you've used the term proletariat. Now, that makes sense to me, especially given the times that we're talking about, because a lot of these reform movements are rooted in Marxism. And Marx, I don't know, most people, I don't know if they know or not, but Marx hated what he called the lumpen proletariat, right? The very poor, the criminal element. So it would make sense that there would be conflict between your working class people and your extreme poor or your criminal element. But also at this time, there were, go through these decades, there was a women's suffrage movement, women's rights movement. There were civil rights movements for African Americans. There was also, of course, later on the temperance movement, and there we had the anti-opium movement, and probably a whole lot that I'm not thinking of. I think it was the Second Great Awakening also took place during this time. Did these various movements conflict with the juvenile, I don't want to say juvenile rights movement, but what do you call the child saving movement?
Child saving movement.
Yeah.
And there's always intersections. There's always intersections. And it depends. And again, we're looking at about 150 years of different things going on. Well, what's kind of interesting is the late 19th. One of the interesting features of the late 19th century is the rise of what we call statistical societies, the birth of the social sciences. And so there's the discovery of anthropology, psychology, political science, the economics of Thomas Malthus. Taught people that if you demography, if you studied statistics, you could make predictions about what the next generations would look like, what their behavior might be like, what their health might be like, what their productivity might be like. So we were studying that. There's also great change. There's also great advancements in psychology and studies of the brain and behavior. They're starting to do experiments on different parts of the brain. They're starting to understand more about what motivates human thought and human action. So they kind of call it social Darwinism, right? Social Darwinism was this belief that if the population of your country or your state would be behaving in a certain way, you could be influential, right? But Europeans and North Americans in the early 1900s became almost as obsessed with this fear of racial degeneration. Right? These eugenics theories about how, if the poor are kind of out, they're swamping the rich. And if they don't start paying attention to how they're using their sexual behavior, then, they always talked about the fall of Rome as being something that they're imminently watching. So they're very worried, right? So a lot of these movements that you talk about, they come out of various kinds of thinking. right? I mean, the early feminists were really interested in racial degeneration. They were worried about, they were interested in sort of the power of men. Women might not be on the same their 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 gender might not make them equal, they would think, but they were morally superior to men. So you got to listen to women, because look at the mess men are making, right? There was that kind of thinking. Again, they were so much worries about immigration and the mixing of the races. Again, they saw this in social Darwinistic terms as something that would drag humanity down. So a lot of it was fear. But on the other hand, there were conservative thinking people who wanted to end birching and beating, corporal punishment, because they argued that the first thing that the Bolsheviks had done when they came to power in Russia was end corporal punishment. So if we beat the children, we might be raising a nation of communists. So again, there's always some kind of overlap. You'll always find somebody arguing the opposite of something else. But there was certainly that idea, though, that the rich needed to go into the homes of the poor, and again, colonizing the bodies of children. We can't do much about the parents, particularly if they're immigrants, right? But we could take those babies and whip them into shape, right? And again, we find the same thing with residential schools for Indigenous peoples. It was the same model: take them away from their parents, and we can kind of anglicize them and teach them the cultural values of a shiny wood floor or cleanliness or whatever. So again, there was a lot, kind of, people really kind of focused on the children, because the children, they figured they had the power to take over.
Now, religion, you said, or Christianity actually was the essence of the moral instruction. Um, First of all, what sects of Christianity were most commonly taught in these reformatories? And when did that begin to sort of taper off, where religion wasn't seen as the focal point of rehabilitation?
Yeah, Protestant religion was the one that the Roman Catholics had their own reformatories. I've rarely even seen the mention of a Jewish child in a juvenile reformatory. One of the interesting things about the lady child savers who were going through the slums of London was you'll never meet a Jewish mother who doesn't look after her children. They admired that so much about Jewish women. But the Roman Catholics, right, the Mediterraneans, the sort of the darker complexion Europeans, they were the ones that they clamped down on, and particularly in the U.S., right? So they were to be Protestant or separatist, right? So the Catholics had their own and the Protestants had their own, and that happened with residential schools too. You'll see now with the lawsuits and things that there'll be a Roman Catholic residential school or a Protestant one. But in sort of mainstream, they were essentially to be Protestant, and Protestants would let other people come in. But the idea was basically, the basic belief was essentially that the social hierarchy, capitalist social hierarchy, would reflect sort of the family of God. So there would be God, the Godfather, and then sort of the child, or God, state, and then sort of the family and the child. So again, it was a hierarchy based on what was perceived to be merit. And so successful people would go to heaven, and unsuccessful people were already sort of predestined to go to hell. And it was their own fault. It was their choice, right? They don't talk about poverty. They talk about pauperism. And pauperism was a state of drinking, laziness, slothfulness. It's all the sins. And that they believe that people chose that, right? So if you could get that group of people to have fewer children, and focus energy on sort of the more middle class blessed people, then you should in theory have a better society. That was their thinking. So
And
that's
when
where
did
it comes
that
into place.
when did that start to fizzle out in the justice system, where you weren't just inundated with the Bible? for instance?
Well, I'm sure there's facilities now where you still are. I mean, religion, people don't stop being more religious ever. It just manifests itself in a different way. And so what they start to do in the 1960s and 70s, which is where the real human rights groups come in the 60s and 70s, is it's replaced with psychology, social psychology. So all of the different, human behavioral sciences sort of replace, prayer, right? As a way of getting people to sort of just sort of improve their reasoning and their functioning skills in society. But what you find is that there's like a generational divide. By the 1960s, that first wave of baby boomers, right, has finished university, and they're starting to move into social services, teachers, college, education, law, and they make the changes. The kind of hippies make the changes in the 1960s and 70s, and they're the ones that argue for decarceration. So those big Victorian institutions I described that were built in the 1850s, by the 1950s, they're falling apart. They're cold. They're expensive. They don't match, health codes anymore. And rather than rebuild them, they shift to the group home system, right? Smaller group home systems. And the hippies have the idea that group homes, kids on the street, community care, everybody helps, we'll raise money, we'll have, and so they change the thinking there, right? A new framework comes in at that point. And then that, starts to get mixed in with more use of psychotropic and behavioral drugs. So, children are medicated more. So, you think about the different ways in which any of this affects the mind, right? And you can see there's no real improvement necessarily, right? You can have the pharmacist driving in and out of the driveway of a group home, or you can have the clergyman on a bicycle, right? Like, it's all about some kind of social control, right?
Yeah. You said there's been no improvement, and what that reminds me of is the sort of the pendulum in criminal justice, where it swings back and forth from punishment to rehabilitation should be the emphasis, or punishment and leniency maybe would be the better way to put it, where you say we need to punish harshly, and then the prison system becomes overcrowded, so then they go to leniency, and then the crime rate goes up, maybe not even in response to what they think it's responding to, but nonetheless the pendulum goes back and forth. As a historian, with a historical analysis, is there any hope in your mind of that pendulum ever ending and actually have something new come in that would really change the juvenile justice system, or the adult system for that matter?
Well, I mean, just on a kind of a personal thing that I'm really quite interested in, the idea of working with the entire family. I mean, if a family, right, or parents, whatever you want, however defined, if a family, there's no reason why families can't stay together, right? Whether it's a parent with an addiction or a child with a behavioral problem or whatever, if we could work with the whole family, you've got half a chance, right? Because the family essentially isn't going to go anywhere. And if you can keep the love and the bond, or help facilitate it and nurture it without disrupting it, it'll hang around in the background. It won't go away. It'll be there. You may not be your best friends necessarily, but there's always going to be these people there for you if you can make it easier for people to stay together. But that's really expensive, right?
Well, no.
Well, it doesn't. No, it's not. I mean, you're right.
No,
Absolutely right.
it
That's what
seems so.
gets argued, right? That it'd be too expensive.
But comparatively, no. The most successful modern rehabilitation tools for juveniles are functional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy. And if you just look and say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost, then people say, oh, that's a lot. But if you then compare it to how much the
Yeah.
alternative is going to cost, they're actually very cost effective.
Yeah, yeah,
And so they have made movements toward those types of things.
yeah.
I don't know how much movement there's been. As somebody who's not a big fan of taxation and government spending. I would rather see private charities doing it than see the government do it. But we do have evidence that the type of thing that you're talking about, where you involve the entire family, is
Mhm.
far more effective.
Yeah.
I, but convincing people of that is a
Yeah,
different
that
story
was, I was
altogether.
thinking that too. Again, also too, I mean, and who is family, right? There's family of choice, there's grandparents, there's uncles and aunts, there's, there's the baby is born, right? A child is born, and the more people that can get to know and love that child, well, it's still lovable. Like under the age of 2, well, there's still a chance. It's better for the child overall. Yet, those are the years when state intervention is likely to be the most extensive if there's poverty and problems and addictions and things. But children very much are the sort of first victims of this. They are the first ones affected. And how many adults can let a kid down before they just start acting out, and they don't care anymore, right? And then they're wandering the streets, and then they get labeled by a teacher, they get labeled by a neighbor, they get labeled somehow, and then the surveillance starts to kick in and everything escalates, and the child feels less and less welcome wherever they go. And then the system map kind of kicks in. But one of the things with the juvenile reformatory system in the late 19th century was they were totally aware that they weren't dealing with hardened criminals, that they were just bunglers. They were just kids who were status offenders wandering around truancy, hanging around in gangs, smoking cigarettes, swearing, just harassing the police. And in big cities, in larger cities, kids could kind of have a little a longer run for their money. But in small towns, the magistrates and sheriffs could clamp down really quickly, right? And seeing the asylum, sorry, the juvenile reformatory as a good place for any child, right? Whose parents were poor and suffering, whose dad was a drunk and unemployed, and the mother hung around this, front step gossiping with their neighbors. I mean, it was seen as a good place for that child. It was seen as progressive. And if we catch the child young and we put them in a reformatory, you'll never need the prison. This could empty the prisons, they would say, right? If you catch them young.
Of course, that
So,
hasn't happened.
no, of
The
course not.
prison population exploded, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, they didn't think about labeling and not giving them a decent education when they were in there. No talk of high school or anything, you know. Yeah. And then again, these institutions did historically anyway have a tendency to attract a certain kind of person as a staff member that they don't as much anymore. But there used to be sort of a brutal military trained type person who, after their military service ended and they needed a job, these kind of schools kind of attracted a lot of sort of tough love type people. Um,
Mean people.
Mean people. I didn't want to say that, but that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Linda, is there anything that we didn't get to that you think we should have for this discussion?
Not really, not really. No, I don't know what
Okay.
you're going to do with it.
All right. So where can people find you?
University of Guelph. I'm at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, which is in Southern Ontario in Canada.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
All righty. Okay,
All
bye-bye.
right. Bye bye. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.